Okay, everybody, if we can have your attention. If you can have your attention, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. So, good evening. My name is Will Carmody. I'm the head of the Financial Services Department in Mason Hayes and Curran, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. It's great to see everybody here in such large numbers here in the room together in person. COVID didn't stop us, of course. We had 2 Zoom Financial Services Insight events in 2020 and 21, but it's really fantastic to get everybody back together in person. That's really the essence of these events, is the opportunity to meet, mingle, discuss, debate, and that's what we missed when we were doing all these events remotely. So the original concept of this Financial Services Insights event was to really create a forum for our clients to have the opportunity to hear from influential opinion formers, expert commentators on the issues of the day, and in a world that's increasingly complicated and unstable and disrupted, it's never been more important to have insightful and informed opinion that then hopefully helps us make the right decisions then in our businesses. And I'm under no illusion that you're here expecting those insights from me, so don't worry. Our guest speaker this evening, on the other hand, will certainly fulfill that role. Janan Ganesh is one of the most respected political and cultural commentators writing today. He has a unique ability to read current political, economic and cultural forces and in motion, and then to distill all of that down to the core questions really that we have to address to understand today's complex world. We have to learn how to look at the world as others see it, how our competitors see it, our allies, even our potential enemies. You can't just assume everybody else sees the world the same way we do. And that type of critical, independent thought that challenges our inbuilt biases, it's really essential to optimizing our decision making, not just in business, but in life as well. And Janan's opinions and analysis provide those insights for us and really help us to do that. As we all know, it feels like we're going through an era of really significant change and sort of dramatic geopolitical upheaval and having effects outside of the narrow sort of financial and business consequences. They're leading to profound and fundamental changes in the structures of our society. We appear to be witnessing some sort of slow, gradual unraveling of the rules-based liberal democratic order that came in after World War II, and which brought so much prosperity, well, initially anyway, to Europe and to the States. There's a turning away now from globalization, an increase in protectionism and nationalism, and culminating in the election of these sort of autocratic, reactionary type leaders in the world, in parts of the world that we previously would have regarded as liberal democracies. And then in addition, there's a widening inequality gulf that sort of threatens to undermine essentially the social contract that has prevailed in the West for the last 80 years or so. But there's also grounds for optimism. We've waged what looks like quite a successful war on COVID, in some parts of the world anyway. And also there's been a surprisingly united response from the West to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I don't think anyone expected the coordinated, ordered, coordinated military and political sanctions response that came from Europe and the States so quickly. So I suppose, where's all that leading to? What will our societies look like in 30 years' time? That's Janan's job, not mine, and nobody better to weave together the threads of this tapestry of economics, politics, culture and history to help us make sense of things. So the format will be, Janan's going to address us now for about 25 minutes or so. We'll have a chat after that. We'll also have Q&A for the audience, so there's plenty of opportunity for everybody to ask questions. We also have a poll that will be running. It's only 4 questions. You'll be able to answer it really quickly, 30 seconds probably. So if you could scan the QR code that's on the screen behind us or on the little pop-ups on the table, they'll bring you to the event app. And the answers to that poll actually would be very interesting to take the audience's view of those, and we'll use those then in our conversation as well later on. So without further ado, over to Janan.
Thank you for the warm welcome. This is my first visit to Dublin since 2018, and to give you a sense of how long ago that was, Declan Rice was still a popular man in this country, still wearing the green rather than the white. We in the UK considered Theresa May to be about as bad a prime minister as a country of 67 million people could realistically produce, rather than someone who would now probably make it onto a Mount Rushmore of modern UK leaders, given what's followed her. And the ultimate change since 2018, which some of us are bitterly aware of, is that in 2018, if you were a Brit of Asian immigrant background, you could turn around to your parents and say, look, I've made it as a lawyer or a banker or even a journalist, and that would be enough to impress even the most hard-driven, unreasonable immigrant parents. Now, if you're not head of government for a G7 nation with a billionaire wife, you are a disgrace to the family. So I want to thank Rishi Sunak for that contribution to the community. I should say another thing about Dublin, which I discovered as I was walking around today. The city, and you may disagree, but the city seems about as energetic and as active as I remember it before the pandemic. And we all went through that 18-month period where we didn't know whether we would ever have the vitality of our cities back again. I was living in America for 4 years and refused to visit London throughout the entire pandemic, not for health reasons, but because I didn't want to see my city in that condition. So it's to be able to see London and now today Dublin at or near what they were in 2019 is a profound pleasure, and I've never been happier to hear people in Dublin complain about the traffic. You'd rather have overly busy roads than the deathly silence we had 2 years ago. I thought what I would do, rather than give you a rolling news summary of everything that's going on in politics, most of which you'll be across anyway, is maybe put forward an argument or just a theme and see if you respond to it. And the theme is the difficulty, maybe even the complete folly of prediction. So if I ask you to turn your thoughts back a few years, and actually 2018 is a good baseline, if you turn your thoughts back to New Year's Day 2018, all of us have had certain things about the world that we were sure of. We will all have had certainties about the world. Certainty number one, land wars between states in and around the Western world, at any rate, were a thing of the past. Conflict, to the extent that it existed, would be with terrorists and other non-state kind of irregular groups. And to the extent that states came into conflict with each other, it would be at the level of trade, cyber, espionage. And that view was so pronounced at the time that I remember a colleague of mine getting a group of us together at the FT, including the editor, and saying that we should do an editorial calling for the end of the UK's nuclear deterrent. And the argument was, I have to say, almost completely persuasive at the time. The argument was, there's no need to deter nation states again, and the money would be better spent on cyber capacity or special forces, all the kind of granular, nimble side of warfare. That was absolutely the view, almost a consensus in media circles, political circles, diplomatic circles, not long ago. Certainty number two, the economic danger facing the Western world was Japanification, which is the persistently low inflation, maybe even deflation, low interest rates, low returns, all the problems that afflicted Japan after 1990. A kind of economic decline through chronic rather than acute causes. Certainty number 3, as revealed by Brexit and the election of Donald Trump and the strong showing of Marine Le Pen in France, the public in rich countries had become incurably anti-authority and anti-expert. And so, for example, if the authorities, advised by the experts, were to do something like propose a huge incursion into your personal liberty in order to secure some kind of social end, public health outcomes, for example, it would fall apart. It would be laughed out of the room by an irreverent, disobedient, cynical Western public. And certainty number 4, which has been alluded to already, the West is fatally divided. The US is losing interest in NATO. Some European countries are losing interest in NATO. The president of France at the time described NATO as brain dead. And were the West or a friend of the West to come under attack, there'd be no chance of a cohesive and robust Western response. All of those certainties were completely reasonable in 2018 and completely laughable as we approach the end of 2022. So to take them in order, we have the biggest land war, biggest conventional territorial land war in Europe since 1945. No one is worrying about deflation. As someone who eats out every night, I could do with some deflation in the London area. Anti-authority, anti-expert, yes, there's a lot of it, but there was overwhelming observance and respect for the lockdown rules in most developed nations, including the UK, which had really severe lockdown rules. And there was overwhelming participation in the vaccine mandates. So even the anti-elite mood or spirit of the age turned out to be less pronounced than we may have thought. And on the last point, the divided West, we've seen how the West has cohered and stood up imperfectly but surprisingly well since February. We can now say that the West is both bigger in extent, because Sweden and others are aspiring to join NATO, but also stronger in depth, because existing members of NATO are committing to spending more on defense. Now, there's nothing profound or shocking about the fact that predictions go wrong and certainties turn out to be flawed. And everyone in financial services, everyone in the political punditry business knows that this is just an occupational hazard. But what interests me about the 4 predictions that I laid out is that they were all wrong in the same way. They all extrapolated from the present. Seems to me there are 2 ways of getting the future wrong. One is that you assume the future will be completely different and fantastical, and that is where a lot of science fiction comes from. It's where a lot of the over-optimism in Silicon Valley comes from. But the other way of getting the future wrong is just by inferring too much from what you already know. It's by assuming the future will just be the present day, but more so. And that appears to be the trend of recent years. We have erred on the side of continuity rather than erring on the side of too much kind of imagination and exotic dreaming about the future. The reason I'm taken with this theme is that I'm beginning to suspect and discover through conversations with colleagues and others that we're about to make another round of mistakes based on extrapolation from the present. And the ones I thought I would float and see whether they provoke a response are these 3. Labour will definitely win the next UK general election. Again, if you extrapolate from present evidence, this is a no-brainer. They are 20 points ahead in the opinion polls now. The Conservative government is divided now, and the UK economy is a mess now. But if you turn your gaze away from present evidence and look at underlying fundamentals, I think you'd have to conclude that there's money to be made in the betting markets by voting against the likelihood of a Labour government at the next election. So what are the fundamentals I have in mind? Well, going back to something I alluded to earlier, I think Rishi Sunak is the first Prime Minister, UK Prime Minister, since the middle of 2016 who is technically capable of doing the job. I think Liz Truss, Boris Johnson and Theresa May, in very different ways, were not suited to the highest office. With Truss, it was bad judgment. With Johnson, it was inattention to detail. And with Theresa May, choosing my words carefully, the volume and speed of information that a Prime Minister has to deal with, I think, was too much. And anyone who was following her as Home Secretary in the preceding years would have been able to tell that that step up was going to be too much. Now, I don't think Rishi Sunak I don't want to pretend that he's some kind of executive genius. I did a column 2 weeks ago saying that we overrate his record and his perceived competence. And the furlough, which he gets a lot of credit for, every rich nation had a furlough of some kind. It wasn't a unique achievement on his part. But relative to the standard since the middle of 2016, it's clear to me that he exceeds that standard. And the surest way of an old government, a 12-year-old government, getting re-elected is not through grand vision. It's a demonstration of basic competence. The idea that you might govern a little bit better than the principal alternative. And I think Rishi Sunak is the first Prime Minister for 6 years, 6.5 years, to give the Tories some hope of that. So that's one fundamental, one reason why I think the polls will turn around before the next election. The other reason, and there's no Irish equivalent of this because you don't have a straightforward right versus left party system, is this: a recession does not mean the same for a Tory government as for a Labour government. If a recession happens under a Tory government, it can still turn around and say to the opposition, what is the point of you now? There's no money around. If you want to do what the Labour government exists to do, which is redistribute, you're going to have to increase taxes at a time when taxes are already high, or increase borrowing at a time when debt is already high. And that message has been the message of every incumbent Tory government in my lifetime, and it succeeds more often than it fails. There was a vicious recession in the UK in the early 80s. The Tories got re-elected after it. There was an almost as bad recession in the early 90s. The Tories got elected after it. There was a horrible recession, as you know more than most nations, in 2008. Labour did not get re-elected after it. The political consequences of a recession are asymmetrical for, or seem to be, asymmetrical for Tories versus Labour governments. So just two fundamental reasons why, or two underlying conditions which I think make the current betting and the current commentary about UK politics mistaken. The other certainty about the future that I think is really catching on back home, and I'm interested to find out what the conversation is here, is that Brexit is a done deal and a settled matter for a generation. Again, all the existing evidence, if you extrapolate from the present day, points in that direction. The Tories are anti-EU. Labour does not want to discuss the subject for fear of alienating some voters. But you look beneath the bonnet again, and you're faced with trends that I think will tell eventually. Economic reality is one. We are getting poorer as a country in the UK, and the public are increasingly aware of that and drawing the link with Brexit. But there are other trends that are even deeper than that. One is demographic churn. If you were 12 years old at the last referendum, you can vote. And statistically, because of your youth, you are much more likely to be pro-Remain than pro-Leave. At the other end of the age scale, people who voted Brexit in their 70s and 80s are, and again, I'll choose my words carefully, leaving the electorate. And I wouldn't want to overdo this trend. I'm not saying every young person is pro-EU, every old person is anti, but the general trend points towards the underlying conditions being quite favourable for a change of mind at some point in the future. And of course, the other fundamental, which does not get written about at all in the UK, but I think is more of a subject on the continent, is this. What caused Brexit was free movement. And what free movement really meant was the inflow of people from Central and Eastern Europe. That was completely logical at the time. 2004, the UK was at its economic peak. Central and Eastern Europe had only relatively recently stopped the heavily statist communist system. In 2022, the economic gap between, for example, the Baltics and the UK, or Poland and the UK, is narrowing at a rate that is inspirational if you're Polish, and pretty depressing if you're from the UK. But it does mean that in the long term, even in the medium term, the incentive to migrate from East and Central Europe towards the UK will be far lower than it was between 2004 and the Brexit referendum. So even the biggest obstacle to rejoining at least the single market, which is free movement, I think can be overplayed because of the underlying economic change. And again, it's something you would not pay attention to if you were focused on present-day evidence and extrapolating too much from that evidence. I'm conscious of time, so before we sit down and have a chat and open it up for questions, I want to cite one more modern-day certainty that I think is overpriced. And it's relevant tonight because of the midterms in the US. And the certainty is this, that America is fatally and irrevocably divided. Once more, you look around at all the present-day evidence and America is viciously, horribly divided. I was less than a mile from the Capitol when the siege happened almost 2 years ago. Spent 4 years of my life in that country and felt how the political divide permeates so much. But there is an underlying trend that I would draw your attention to. What is it that caused America to be so divided? Well, there's a huge change in the media, deregulation of broadcasting in the 90s, social media after that, a big economic rupture when they lost a lot of their industrial base. But for me, the single most persuasive account as to why America is as split as it is that in 1989, it lost its unifying enemy, or its unifying rival in the Soviet Union. And the amount of evidence that shows that American partisanship really took off post-1989 is, to me, persuasive. One kind of obscure but telling statistic is that when you confirm a Supreme Court judge, it goes before the Senate and the Senate has to make a decision. As recently as the 1980s, you had unanimous approvals of Supreme Court nominations, 100 votes versus 0, or 96 versus 0, or 99 versus 0. It happened throughout the 1980s. There were 3 or 4 of them in the 80s. There hasn't been one since the end of the Cold War. Now, it's a tiny statistic, but I think it's emblematic of a wider trend, which is that as soon as the Soviet Union fell, Americans were at liberty to turn in on themselves. All that energy had to go somewhere. And I think it went into domestic politics and your fellow citizen rather than an external threat. If you find that idea persuasive, then you will already have finished my thought. What America is gaining, some would say losing because it's losing its superiority in military power and economic power. What it's gaining in the form of China, I think, if you had to isolate one optimistic thing about it, is some kind of glue, some kind of external menace or competition at least, which forces Americans to look outward again for the first time in 30 plus years. And for that reason, I think in my profession, we're in danger of over-egging present-day discord in America and underrating the structural global changes that might help the country survive as a coherent republic into the future. So Labour and their certainty to win the next election, Brexit as a settled question, and the permanence of American civil and political division, I think are examples of overconfident bets based on current day evidence. And I don't need to tell a financial services audience that present performance is no guide to future results. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Janan. As we get settled here, if I could just ask everybody as well to have a look at those poll questions, because they're actually sort of structured a little bit around some of those three big bets, so it'd be interesting for us to see what everybody thinks about those. So if you could have a look at those and answer those questions, that'd be great. So, Janan, maybe to start with that sort of big question of the sort of threat to democracy and what's happening at the moment. I thought one of your recent articles was particularly interesting and just a nicely shade of provocation as well. When I think the basic premise of it was you were suggesting that a lot of the blame that lies maybe for the sort of rise of extremist views lies actually with the so-called sort of sensible middle part of the population, as opposed to the political extremes or the sort of very voluble and loud Trumpists and the fault of inequality, all the tropes that are very often rolled out as part of the reason for extremism. But actually, your view is that if the general population continues to sort of drift in a casual, unthinking way, I suppose, towards these types of candidates, that's actually causing a massive erosion of our sort of democratic liberal values, and it might take actually a massive shock for us to realize, sort of some extreme reaction to one of the major global conflicts that's happening at the moment, to shock us awake and to realize actually what is at risk, and we don't want to have to go to that extreme. Obviously, like is it to be again? Is it actually a sign that there's a real deeper malady in our democratic model? Is democracy too high maintenance? Well, I suppose in one way.
Well, what has struck me since 2016, both in America and in the UK, is it's not extremism. I don't encounter. Clearly, a percentage of the public have extreme views, but you do not get to 52% in a referendum with that. And you do not get to a winning presidential campaign in 2016 by just squeezing the maximum out of the most extreme people in society. What I keep encountering are the complacent next 10, 15, 20% nearer the middle, who really aren't that extreme, some of whom are not even that political. But their view, when you say, what the hell are you doing by flirting with this idea or that candidate, their response is always, what's the worst that could happen? And the reason that mentality exists has to be because of the passage of time since the last time politics went catastrophically wrong, which was the Second World War. You now have to be extremely old to have any living conscious memory of a decision at the ballot box going wrong on a world scale where tens of millions, hundreds of millions die. And that's a good thing that we've had a human lifetime of relatively benign outcomes. But it does, I think, eventually make otherwise sensible people take risks that they would not take in more volatile times. There was an economist called Hyman Minsky who said stability destabilizes. And he was talking about economic bubbles. The longer you get into an economic expansion, the more businesses over-leverage and households over-leverage because they've forgotten the last dip in the cycle. But I think what he said, stability destabilizes, applies as much to politics, that the longer you get into a period of peace and prosperity, the more risks you take. And the problem with my analysis, my colleague Martin Wolf pointed this out, the problem with my analysis is that the solution is what? You induce a war every couple of generations to keep people honest. There's no... The last bit of the analysis, the kind of recommendation, is missing. But I'm convinced, having talked to people, ordinary voters, politically engaged voters, politicians in my screwed up political system and in the American system, that what really has changed in the past 10 or so years is the complacency, not the extremism.
Okay, yeah. I suppose you would hope as well, whilst it's messy, there's a nimbleness to democracy, it rewards original thinking and brave thinking. It doesn't necessarily reward the sort of autocratic, who's next on the pecking order approach to things. So you would hope that helps us work our way out of it.
Well, you've seen, Russia this year has been a good example of what happens when you don't have a feedback mechanism and accountability.
Yeah.
And as bad as Liz Truss was, we got rid of her in 6 weeks. So it's, the nimbleness is
there's the example.
Yeah.
Very good. Sinead, I don't know, do we have results on the first question maybe for the poll? Will we pop it up there and see? So this was our... Now, so what is the biggest medium threat to global political stability? Right, interesting. Rise of authoritarian... Oh, we're still getting votes in. Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah. I would have guessed Russia would have come top ahead of China.
Yeah. Considering. Excellent. Very good. I'm surprised that Donald Trump would be very unhappy with his low polling numbers there, actually. So he doesn't like low ratings. So I suppose speaking of the US midterm elections, obviously, which are, I think polling has probably opened now. We won't get any results really till the middle of the night. So it'll be some hours yet. But you obviously spent some time living and writing in the States. You've studied US politics very carefully. So it must be a high probability now, and particularly, I think he said, our friend Mr. Trump said yesterday, it's very, 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 very likely that he'll make an announcement in the next day or two. But it does look, in the context of what's happening there, that it would be highly probable that he will get re-elected. You have, Biden was elected by a wafer-thin majority at a time when they marshalled all the forces of objection and outrage at Trump amongst the media and et cetera, and the appalled middle ground anti-Trump voter got them out, and even still only won by a sliver. Now they're facing into a potential re-election where, you could have a recession, you could have US troops falling on foreign battlefields again. You will have a candidate, if it is Biden, who's going to be probably 80 years of age, unlikely to be forging a campaign across the country. So it's going to be very difficult. And I suppose, so if that does happen, at least in 2016, it looked like actually Trump wasn't actually prepared for power. He wasn't expecting it. But this time around, he could have a majority in Congress and the Senate, a stacked Supreme Court. There's a swath of election-denying candidates standing for the Senate and local and Secretary of State, etc. elections, who actually have quite a lot of power in how the next election is run. There's a lot to be pessimistic about there. Should we be very afraid, or I suppose will the existing checks and balances that actually seem to just about hold the line the last time, will they do the job again?
Well, I always say I left America at the right time. Because, I'm not sure you want to be there in 2024. The note for, one reason to sort of deflate Trump's bubble a little bit is that, he lost the popular vote in 2016. He took an absolute hiding at the first midterms in 2018, lost re-election, which is more unusual than not in recent American history. His polling rating never exceeded a pretty low level while he was president. He is, it's because it was such a shock in 2016, it is easy to forget that he's still unpopular and I think eminently beatable if the Democrats avoid choosing either the incumbent, not because he's bad, but because he's just too old. I think he's 80 now, and he'll be 82 or about to turn 82 at the next presidential election. And they avoid the vice president. Because whatever your personal preferences or mine, she just doesn't register well with the average voter. I wrote, when she was chosen as, this is Kamala Harris, when she was chosen as the running mate in the summer of 2020. I did a column that was mildly lukewarm. And saying, have you thought about this? She literally finished last in the primaries because she ran out of money. If you're a California senator and you've got access to the deepest donor pool on the planet, you should not be withdrawing first. I floated there as a little column, and I got a lot of pushback from colleagues saying, as you know, it was just, I think criticism of the priority at that time was getting Trump out for a lot of people, and it blinded people to what was an appalling choice of running mate. And if it's not Biden and it's her instead, that's one way I could see Trump winning in next time. If it's almost anyone else, any of the good, young, middle-of-the-road Democrats, Pete Buttigieg, Gina Raimondo's Commerce Secretary, even Gavin Newsom, who's a controversial governor of California, but a decent performer, I'd lean towards the Democrats winning the White House next time. It also helps, by the way, I think it helps the Democrats win the presidency in 2024 if they lose Congress now, as part of the natural pendulum.
Check and balance.
Completely. You want the public, you know, the man or woman who determines American elections, that marginal voter, all they do is just check their previous decision. You know, you vote a Democrat president, okay, first midterms, vote for a Republican Congress. A Republican Congress acting in a pretty partisan way for 2 years, I think makes it more likely that a Democrat wins in 2024. Whereas if you have a unified Democratic House, Senate, White House for the next 2 years, you can imagine a big building up of anti-Democrat hostility.
Yeah. Just picking up on one of the questions here, actually, which is sort of related to Trump. Where's it gone? If Donald Trump is elected in 2 years' time, will he abandon support for Ukraine and make a deal with Putin to preserve peace between Russia and the US? You know, this underlying suspicion of the Trump-Putin alliance.
I don't think he will. I've always had an unusual view about this, which is, look, Trump has a complex attitude towards people like Putin and dictators generally. One side of it, yes, is the kind of the fawning, flattering thing that he does, and the fascination with untrammeled power, which you don't get in a democracy. So there's that, and maybe some financial links or whatever. But on the other hand, he's unbelievably aggressive when he wants to be. So his attitude towards Kim Jong-un in North Korea alternated from, I love this kid like a son, and I'm going to nuke him off the planet if he says no to some perfunctory. You know, he seems to have. I might be over-flattering him here, but I think he understands. He has some kind of insight into the dictator mentality, which is that in order to stand up to one, you have to be dictator-like. You have to have a volatile streak, an aggressive streak, a hard-to-read streak, which Nixon called the madman theory. I want the North Vietnamese to think that I'm a madman because I can then do anything. And it is my favorite statistic now, and I get absolute dog's abuse at the FT when I quote it, is the only president this century, only US president this century, who has not presided over a Russian attack on a neighboring state is Trump. And that's probably, you know, Obama oversaw the initial Ukraine attack, Bush Jr. oversaw the attack on Georgia, and Biden this year. Now, very small sample size, probably a coincidence, but I think I wouldn't rule out the possibility that something about Trump's volatile aggression, refusal to be messed with, hatred of losing face on the international stage, makes him perversely quite good in this type of situation. So I wouldn't. And another thing I would say is that the Republican Congress or Republican Congress members have been almost uniformly hardline against Russia, not just since the invasion, but before the invasion. They were the ones who proposed imposing sanctions on Russia pre-invasion, just for lining up troops on the border. That includes Marco Rubio in Florida. So I'm not a fan of the modern Republican Party, but this bit, I think, is the easy equation between them and Putinism, I think needs more scrutiny.
Yeah, I think you wrote a column a little while back, didn't you, about sometimes our liberalism is that liberals are a little bit too soft
Completely.
in defending their
Completely.
territory.
I've always said the best case for conservatism is it's a defense of liberalism by people who don't trust liberals to do it. You need something else. You need a bit of...
Yeah. Need a brute to catch a brute.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You need a darker side.
Yeah, very good. Okay, Sinead, we might pop up the next poll result there as we're going. See, so what is more likely to trigger a global recession? Continued high inflation, conflict with China, continued elevated energy prices. Continued elevated energy prices. Oh, you have that twice. And base case interest rate. Oh, interest rates lowest. That's interesting. Wonder should we have included the Trump re-election in that poll question as well. Thank you. Okay, yeah, thanks. Very good. So so maybe to sort of hop to the other side of the world, then from what's happening in the US at the moment, and I suppose if Russian aggression is the sort of storm battering Europe today, we could nearly say that the rise of authoritarian China is the long-term climate change existential threat to the West and to Europe. And a couple of interesting things came out of the recent Communist Party Congress, and there was a lot of coverage, obviously, about the packing of the Politburo with Parachik and the removal of his predecessor. But there was one thing that struck me that didn't get an awful lot of coverage, got some commentary, was the very subtle policy pronouncements around a slight change in outlook for China away from that embracing of the rest of the world, more back towards reliance on self-sufficiency, isolationism. Apparently there was a very academic article published on one of the Chinese sites that is only covers government approved pronouncements deliberately to sort of provoke a conversation. So that's actually quite a departure, obviously, for a country that has generated such wealth over the last 40 years from precisely that, from opening up and engaging with the rest of the world. I suppose if one was prone to have a suspicious mind, you could speculate that that's a useful preparation for China, preparing for some isolation from the rest of the world. If you were to further speculate, that type of circumstance could arise during or after an attack on Taiwan, for example. And also, if you were very cynical, you could say the current zero COVID policy is also a useful drill for how do you disengage from the rest of the world and pull back. I suppose there's a lot happening there. What are your thoughts on what's happening in China?
Well, the turn away from open markets is real. All the people I know who really, really know China, and that ranges from colleagues of mine to the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, they disagree on lots of things. They all converge on one point, which is this: they really, really are a communist party. Don't assume that because they opened up for 30 years that they abandoned or let go of the underlying doctrine. There's an intense suspicion of the free operation of the market. Even at its most open, I don't think it was ever possible to buy more than 49% of a significant Chinese business. And to the extent you could buy your way into that country, it was conditional. They've never let go of the underlying doctrine. And what I imagine you're seeing is a reassertion of that. For me, the question of the century is, were China to attack Taiwan in an open, direct way, rather than slowly undermining it in the Hong Kong style, is what the US would do. And it's so finely poised, because if the US does defend Taiwan militarily, you have potentially World War III. If it doesn't, then you almost certainly have the end of the American empire, because Japan, South Korea, I imagine most Western European countries, the Baltics, would assume, okay, they didn't defend Taiwan. We now infer that whatever security umbrella the Americans have provided for us for 70 years is invalid. Now, I think that would be the wrong interpretation, because remember, America does not have a security guarantee with Taiwan. It has a form of words that's ambiguous, but it's not a NATO-style agreement. But I think if America doesn't defend Taiwan in the event of an invasion or a military attack, the inference that major American allies will draw is that we're on our own, we have to make our own arrangements from now on. And almost overnight, you'll feel the power, not the hard power, but the moral authority draining from America's security underwriting of much of the world.
Yeah, yeah.
So which is worse?
Yeah.
The war itself, which would be like heinous and potentially existential for everyone, or America forfeiting its role as the security provider of most of the world, or much of the world.
Yeah. Hobson's choice. Yeah. I suppose coming back a little bit closer to home, we don't have to go to the other side of the world to find chaos and disruption. What's happening in Westminster at the moment, as you said, has received a lot of commentary and analysis. You're probably sort of fatigued talking about it at the moment, but I suppose whilst it has a particular relevance for us here in Ireland as well, because whilst maybe it started off as mildly entertaining theatre, it gets quite serious quite quickly for us, in particular in respect of the impact leadership in London has on Northern Ireland. The stalemate around the Northern Ireland Protocol at the moment has people quite worried here as a very real threat to the peace that was hard won and flowed from the Good Friday Agreement. I suppose, like with so many other urgent items on the agenda for Rishi and the Cabinet in the UK, does the Irish question fall right down the list of priorities? Or actually, maybe does the need to do that bigger deal with Europe for trade and services, etc., mean that it does have to get dealt with? How do you see that happening?
I think your second scenario is the one that will play out.
Yeah.
So we're past that 4 or 5 year period where the Conservative government could entertain fantasies of endless trade deals. That's clearly fading, partly because it was never realistic, but partly because the big prize, which was China, is less plausible a trade prize than it was at the time of Brexit. So
mainly because it's on the other side of the world.
Well, yeah, exactly. There's the thing that geography has not been abolished. And but the feud between China and the West means it's less viable anyway. So they have to concentrate more on the European market. People are feeling the pinch of not being able to export as easily as 5 years ago. So there's that logic. Also, perversely, precisely because Rishi Sunak has some very extreme Eurosceptic MPs, it forces him to at least engage with the issue of the protocol, because they hate it, they want it revised. That's implausible and, to a large extent, illegal. But it forces them to do, or it makes it impossible to do what lots of previous prime ministers would have had the luxury of doing, which is ignore the subject. It's precisely because he's got 20, 30 really radical MPs.
But Rishi himself also is a genuine Brexiteer.
Oh, complete Brexit. Yeah.
Trust and
exactly. No, it's the first unambiguous, true believing Brexit prime minister.
Yeah.
If you assume Johnson was always he could have gone either way.
Yeah, until he flipped the coin. And
Completely. Or licked his finger and stuck it in the air and felt which way the wind was going. But I think you just say Rishi Sunak has domestic parliamentary management reasons to at least engage with the issue. Doesn't mean he'll have a viable solution.
Yeah.
And the closest thing that they mention, I think Chris Heaton-Harris thinks there's a way of, technically retaining the substance of there being a border in the Irish Sea, but downgrading the severity of the checks on goods.
Yeah.
So you essentially have the form of words doesn't change, the implementation changes. I'm not sure how viable that is, but what Rishi Sunak absolutely cannot do is marginalise the issue, because they mistrust him enough, the Tory right. He'll have to keep coming back to the issue. He might come into it in a way that you regret.
Yeah.
You'll have to engage with it.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, maybe I'm just conscious of time. Maybe to pick up on a couple of the questions that we've got from the audience here, and I think you can continue to submit questions as we're chatting here. One, maybe we touched on it ourselves when we were chatting earlier on, so maybe I'll pick up on this one. Jenan, what do you think about the future trajectory of the tech industry in light of news this week of sweeping redundancies across the sector, all changing very quickly there?
Well, it partly depends on what we mean by tech industry. I saw an extraordinary stat the other day. Apple and some other, it was Apple and some other hardware tech firm is now worth as much as all the FANGs put together, right. Which absolutely was not the case about 2, let alone 5 years ago. So it might be one bit of tech, the frothier social media side of it, that's going through the particularly acute crisis. But whenever, I was in California for the last of my 4 years in America, and I got the sense that it was going through a blip, the industry, but the secular trend was still upwards. Mm. And what struck me was the movement. I know you've got an office in San Francisco, but the movement of people and business and capital from Northern California to Southern California. Okay. But I just think such a young technology in grand historical terms, still a decent number of unconquered markets. The potential for we were talking earlier that, the speed with which TikTok superseded Twitter and Facebook among the younger generation as the thing just leads me to believe that there'll be something else in 6 months. Yeah. And so the potential dynamism is still there. For me, the real threat to the industry is not internal, it's not anything to do with the finances, it's the potential end of such a thing as a global internet. If you have China, and to a large extent India now, wanting more of a national internet, including control over the servers.
I suppose arguably China has that already, haven't they?
Yeah. China's always had it to some extent, but it's intensifying. India will be interesting because it's a billion, it's going to overtake China as the biggest country in the world, loads of English speakers. You think it's just, you monetize even a small, I always think this about the Premier League, people think it's as dynamic and rich as it can ever be. You then go to someone like India or Southeast Asia and you think you haven't even begun to monetize this. So the potential should be huge, but if the governments say we ultimately do not trust the free flow of information to this extent, and we're going to have more sovereign control over it, does that mean there is such a thing as a global internet user market anymore? I'm not sure there is, actually.
Yeah, but that's interesting. Arguably, the Elon Musk takeover of Twitter might accelerate that thinking, where you have one individual now with such control.
Completely. I see the Musk situation as catastrophic regulatory failure. The fact that he's, I've got no strong views on him as an individual, but the fact that one
person has the control of that platform.
To an extent that influences military strategy in Ukraine strikes me as there must have been a series of regulatory failures 5 years ago. It should have been possible to anticipate.
Yeah. Okay, actually we've a couple of Brexit questions here, so we might put up the results of our Brexit question, which I think was, do we see Brexit being reversed before 2040, I think we said. So it might be interesting to see what the answer to that is. A second. Where is it? Yeah, the question from the audience, just whilst that is coming up, was why is there no political discussion at the moment in the UK about reversing Brexit?
Everyone in the Tory party hates the EU. The Labour Party knows what needs to be done, but is understandably very sensitive about alienating pro-Brexit voters in the North, in the Midlands especially. What will change is the Labour half. The Tory half of the equation is not going to change, but Labour will gradually feel braver about discussing it. I've seen this before in politics. Something has to happen. The remorseless logic is pointing in one direction, and it's a question of when do events catch up. But I think Labour have to win an election and in power begin to soften the position. When I say change or soften the position, I don't mean immediate referendum, total...
You start the conversation.
And I think it begins with rejoining the customs union.
Yeah.
Because the power to do external trade deals is turning out to mean not very much. And then the conversation about the single market. And if I'm right that free movement will be less controversial the more time passes, maybe you can do something with some accommodation with the single market. I think you said 2040. I would say earlier that if you told me that by 2030 the UK was, I'm going to weasel out with my choice of words, but was substantially in the single market, I'd have no trouble believing you.
It's interesting because when I was writing that question, first I wrote down 2030, then I wrote 2035, then I wrote 2040.
Yeah, I'm being reckless, but I think the end of this decade doesn't feel like unrealistic short time.
My thinking on it, my sense was the entire political class nearly in Westminster now is so invested in Brexit that you will require nearly a whole new generation of politicians with the bravery to...
That happens. I mean, you've seen what happens to our a political career. I remember Blair became leader in '94 after 11 years as an MP, and that was considered a short time.
Yeah.
You now enter Parliament, you're Prime Minister within 5 years, and once you lose the job, you go. You don't do what happened in the Victorian age, which is hang around, serve as Foreign Secretary, maybe come back as Prime Minister, you are gone.
Yeah.
So that churn that you said is necessary, and I think you're right, that churn does exist.
Yeah.
I mean, the governing class of the UK in 2030 will be unrecognisable. You won't. They're not even in Parliament right now.
Even that quickly, 8 years' time. Yeah, very good.
So people are able to. They don't have a backlog of embarrassing statements about Brexit. There's no U-turn that needs to be performed.
Very good. Might maybe wrap up on this. I'm conscious of time. Are we okay on time? Yeah. Your views on the likelihood of Scottish independence?
Well, I remember that referendum vividly in 2014, and the independence campaign really could have won had they had a persuasive answer on one or two economic questions. Which currency do you use, and who stands behind RBS in the event of another? Yeah. This is when the crash was much more recent as a memory.
Who owns the North Sea resources?
Although that was a kind of a wasting asset, so it was kind of. But that was one. But the two big economic questions, the currency and financial stability, they never quite found an answer to. And I've been away for 4 years, but the impression I get is that they still don't have a definitive currency. Do you rejoin the euro?
Yeah.
Do you join the euro? And how do you overcome Spanish objections or other EU member objections to that? Do you continue using sterling on a sort of renegade basis? Because you kind of accept the flow of money that's decided by the Bank of England, but you continue using the currency. Yeah. Do you launch your own currency? It's that question. It seemed to me in 2014, had they fixed that, it would have been a lot closer than 55, 45. So I don't know whether they've got an answer to that. I don't think they have. Also, in 2014, there hadn't been a huge amount of disruption in British life. We'd had a pretty conventional 20, 30-year period. Yeah. People have now lived through Brexit, multiple changes of prime minister, European crises and Ukraine. The world has been quite exhausting for 8 years. Is the marginal voter more likely or less likely to take another punt on a big change? I suspect less likely. Yeah, because it's just there's a certain amount of weariness and exhaustion. Yeah. So I imagine, and also it's telling that a lot of the independence campaigners' desire or demands for a referendum. There's something. Is it possible to say that sometimes you detect that if it didn't happen in the next couple of years, they wouldn't mind terribly? Yeah. Because if you lose another one within a decade, I mean that ends it for a generation.
Oh, for a generation, certainly. Then,
so I just glean a little bit of realism about that in the way they phrase it. But if I had to choose, I would say I don't. If I had to predict, I'd say it's not going to happen this decade.
Okay. Okay, very good. An interesting question here. Do you think we are actually already in a covert World War III with technology used as the platforms to domestically destabilise the West? Just it caught my eye because you're probably familiar with Pippa Malmgren's writings, and she's written something about this quite recently, actually, as well, that actually this has been going on in the background, in space, in the Pacific arena. What's happening with China? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, the phrase for it is the Second Cold War, not World War in the physical sense, but a Cold War, and it has been going on for years. So, cybercrime, the Chinese influence over what I thought was mainly just Africa and South Asia, and turns out to be the whole of Latin America as well. I mean, huge amounts of investment and therefore influence across the world, including America's backyard. You know, America always had the Monroe Doctrine, which said that the Western Hemisphere was essentially theirs. They would not tolerate an external power gaining a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Well, it's happened. And then the thing you raise, which is space. You know, I've got a friend who's a partner in a law firm in London, and he says the evolving area of law and the most stimulating one is who regulates the building of facilities in space, because China is on that. The US, perversely, despite having NASA, is a decade behind. Yep. And if there's going to be a rivalry there, what laws and norms govern all that? So I think, to use the Cold War metaphor again, I reckon we're living in something like 1952 or something. It's relatively early stages of the. We don't know where, you know.
One of the early Le Carre models.
Exactly. One of the exactly. When it was still black and white Le Carre adaptations.
Yeah.
You know, people are barely conscious of living in a Cold War.
Yeah.
In the way they may not have been particularly conscious at the very beginnings of it.
Yeah.
When it was the West versus the Soviets. But we might look back in 30 years and say, 2022.
How did we not see it?
Yeah, exactly. It was so obvious. And who's going to write the spy novel?
Yeah.
For this one.
Yeah.
So there's a gap in the market.
Very good. We might finish on this one. I think it's a good question, nice question to ask you to finish up on. Who are your heroes?
A lot of them are non-political. Footballers and musicians. Not Declan Rice, but kind of. It's a tough one. I would say, I won't say hero, but a guy who got me into all of this, which is, you know, politics and being interested in stuff that was quite weird for a teenager to be into, was actually Tony Blair. And it's hard to convey to people who are much younger than me, who see him in a very negative light, or people who are much older than me, who lived through lots of exciting politicians in the past, how dynamic he was to see on TV if you were growing up in the UK in the 90s. And he kind of had a way of bringing the questions to life, just through dint of personality, not because he was right about them, but his force of personality, youth. And I would say the Blair worldview, which is a balance of, you know, social safety net, dynamic economy, and crucially, absolute commitment to the European cause, is still basically sensible. More sensible than most of the governing visions that follow.
The ghost of Tony Blair.
Exactly. At least I was worried it's going to be a kind of an assassin's red dot over my head. But yeah, but not a hero, but the guy who kind of provoked my interest in the whole thing is
very good.
Probably Tony Blair.
Excellent. Very good.
And I wouldn't mind being called a Blairite, which puts me in a minority of one, maybe.
Very good. Well, I think we'll wrap it up on that, and really just want to thank you very much for your time. You've been very generous with your time, and I think we'd all like to show our appreciation. And I'd also like to thank all of you for attending and for joining us. We are acutely conscious that we're very fortunate to have a group of successful, innovative and progressive clients, and the success of our business depends upon the success of yours and the trust that you put in us as well, to help and to guide you and to advise you in the challenges that you meet in your business. So we're very grateful for that trust that you put in us, and for the work that you trust to us as well. And we look forward to continuing to return that trust for as long as you will allow us to. So thank you very much for your time here this evening as well.
All good?
Yep.